Welcome, Bennett, and welcome one and all, online and in person. My name's Jonathan Coley. I'm the co-director, along with Kate Grosser, of the RMIT Business and Human Rights Centre. This is a bright lunchtime seminar with the inimitable Bennett Freeman, your one and only speaking engagement also in Melbourne. Your first time in Melbourne too, so we have a lot to live up to. I guess you're pondering the question, is business becoming a responsible actor? Through some reflections on what you've done, what you've seen, and perhaps where we're headed. I wanted to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We acknowledge and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to the elders of other First Nations communities who may be here or zooming in today. Indeed, for those zooming in, I ask that you take a moment to reflect on where you are today. Bright is a research centre that brings together researchers across RMIT and across disciplines investigating various aspects of the relationship between business and human rights, the human rights responsibilities and accountabilities of the corporate sector, from labour rights and modern slavery to tech's ability to promote rights and sustainability. Today we're honoured to host Bennett Freeman to offer some reflections on his journey in the world of business and human rights. Bennett has many different biographies, books long, chapters long. This is the paragraph long biography of Bennett. Bennett Freeman is an Associate Fellow in the International Law Program at Chatham House and advises multinational corporations and NGOs on policy and strategy related to human rights as principal of Bennett Freeman Associates LLC. He's a co-founder of the B4 Ukraine Coalition, pressing Western companies to exit Russia after their aggression in Ukraine. He co-founded and led the diplomatic efforts of the Cotton Campaign to end massive state-imposed forced labour in Uzbekistan. He was the lead author of Shared Space Under Pressure, Business Support for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders. And as US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy and Human Rights and Labour, he led the development of the leading governance tool for responsible security practices called the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. He serves as Chair of the Advisory Board of Global Witness, Vice Chair of the Global Network Initiative, on the boards of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, Oxfam America, and the Institute for Human Rights and Business. I have missed out loads and loads, but hopefully that gives you a sense of Bennett's experience and expertise. So without further ado, let me hand it over to Bennett. Bennett will address us for about 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, and I'm going to watch the clock because I really want to have a discussion with all of you and others online.
Lovely, fantastic. So there'll be an opportunity for everyone to ask questions both online and in person as well. And we will try and wrap up sharply at 1:30.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate the chance to come here, to be in Melbourne, to come to RMIT, and there are so many people who've done such great work over the years in the business and human rights, labor rights, conflict arena. I know a number of them. Whether here or in Sydney or Canberra or Brisbane, some in universities, others in NGOs, some in the legal community, the consulting world. And I'll be seeing a number of my colleagues who I usually see in Geneva or New York or Washington, and so it's great to be here. Just one thing about my bio that I guess is a little unusual is that I've worked on business and human rights as well as conflict issues from 4 different perspectives. As a government, former U.S. government, as a U.S. human rights diplomat, but in other roles for the State Department, but also in the corporate world. When I was a kid, I was hired by the to many infamous CEO of GE, General Electric, Jack Welch, who passed away a few years ago, and was kind of the liberal lefty kid running around GE corporate headquarters, challenging him and others. But I've done a lot of corporate consulting, including recently and a little bit currently, but also the investment world. I was Senior Vice President of Calvert Investments for a decade. the largest sort of what we call SRI, social responsible investment, now ESG asset manager in the U.S. But I'm also in the NGO world, and all these NGO boards I've been on, and many I'm still on. So I have a bit of a composite perspective. I hope it's composite and not schizophrenic, and I try to have some consistency in my values and views for what it's worth. So just to sort of define the subject here, it would be just too overwhelming even to do reflections on a quarter century of business and human rights, and I've really been in the field since the inception of the contemporary business and human rights movement, which I date to the mid-90s. So I focused the reflections a little more narrowly, but still very ambitiously, around the convergence of business, human rights, and conflict. And that's Jonathan's particular interest. Is how we met in Geneva late last year as part of this community of practitioners around business and conflict. So I'm really going to stick to the convergence of business conflict and human rights, rather than ramble off into some of the other areas that many of us in the room, are involved with, whether it's forced labor, modern slavery, and so forth. So I will sort of hit the big question at the end, or maybe I'll just wait until do it in discussion with you, which is business becoming a more responsible actor on human rights and conflict. I guess my sneak preview shorthand answer, if I were mumbling in American vernacular, would be sort of, maybe kind of, but if I were to put it in a more sophisticated way, I would say that we've made tremendous progress in terms of setting standards, setting expectations, absorbing pressures from civil society, from governments, international institutions, from investors. But we have a massively long way to go to really get companies to consistently embrace the very standards that many of them help create, or at least with which they've aligned themselves. So, I wouldn't be able to be in this field. I don't think any of us would, if we didn't have some optimism that we're pushing a rock up the hill that, even if it falls back and crushes us here and there, like Sisyphus, that at least we're moving broadly uphill, even if it's sometimes sideways and backwards. So I do think we're making progress, but I've been at this both at the standard setting level, sort of globally, sectorally, but also on the ground. So what I'm going to try to do here is just reflecting the fact that I have a couple of history degrees, and I love speaking in law schools and business schools without either a JD or an MBA. And, I sort of get away with it. But I'm going to trace the development of the convergence of business, human rights, and conflict through about a dozen landmarks in the field, at least as I've seen them, a number I've been directly involved with. And many of them I will touch on for just 30 to 60 seconds, because I want to make some broader points, and what I really want to do is engage all of you. So here we go. So when we think about business, conflict, and human rights, sure, the story of the contemporary agenda community starts in the mid-1990s, at least in my perspective, my experience. But business, conflict, and human rights have converged for centuries, for a couple of millennia. Ancient and modern slavery, imperialism and colonialism, eradication, extermination, genocide of indigenous peoples on this continent, on my continent, elsewhere around the world, of which we're so acutely aware. And you're now in the middle of a great national debate on voice in Parliament. And then just thinking about merely the last century of business, conflict, and human rights. We could talk about a dozen or a couple dozen different episodes, but I do think World War II was significant, and it's what really focused my attention. The second of my three jobs as a Clinton presidential appointee at the State Department in the 90s was senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, who at the time made it his personal crusade and for the U.S. government. And I was this guy who ran it for the department and interagency 60 or 70 hours a week for 2 years in the mid to late 90s around restitution of Holocaust era assets, but a much more fundamental reckoning of what the wartime neutrals, but also business and financial institutions did and didn't do. And we basically uncovered and held accountable, uncovered the till then fairly hidden economic and financial dimensions of the war and the Holocaust. And we held accountable Swiss banks, European insurance companies. I was in the middle of negotiations with the Swiss banks. We got $1.25 billion settlement in the summer of '98, but it was this extraordinary reckoning, and it was really, I would say it was, maybe was too close to it. I lived in it for a couple of years. It remains to this day the greatest retrospective exercise in corporate accountability for human rights. I mean, retrospective. We have plenty more to do, and I've tried to tangle with Dow over the years on law, which isn't exactly conflict, it's just tragedy and catastrophe. But when you think about the companies involved in that conflict, I mean, IG Farben and Krupp, VW and BMW, Allianz Generale, who allowed the Nazis to confiscate what would be tens of billions in current money of insurance policies of Jews. Just horrific things that happened. IBM, very primitive, crude, kind of pre-punch cards to track deportees in and out of the concentration camps, just gruesome stuff. So not a new subject. Fast forward then to the mid to late 20th century. This takes me to, we overlap. We missed each other by a couple decades at Berkeley, but I was involved in the ground floor of the apartheid, anti-apartheid divestment movement as an undergraduate there. And conflict, yes, but not armed conflict, but internal conflict and a huge exposure of banks and financial institutions and industrial companies and the whole argument about complicity. But to really get to where we are, and it's this whole, what happened in my view, and again, as a participant, beginning midway through my time at the State Department, is I really see the mid-90s as the inflection point. That's when we had two sets of issues converge to create the contemporary business and human rights movement. One of those two sets of issues, of course, was what we called at the time sweatshop labor, particularly footwear and apparel. That gave way to the Fair Labor Association, the Ethical Trading Initiative, all this work that so many of us have done over the years around the world on supply chain labor and human rights, on forced labor, on human trafficking, and so forth. The other prong, though, was conflict related, and we know the tragedy that galvanized the attention of the world. And it sure as hell caught my attention, even though I was in a role where I couldn't get involved in it at the time in '95, was the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the other Agoni 9 by the then military junta in Nigeria, and the firestorm of criticism around Shell as the dominant producer in the Niger Delta. And Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Agoni 9 and their colleagues were environmental human rights activists going after Shell at least as much as they were going after the Nigerian government. This is partly in a conflict context. There was low intensity conflict in the Niger Delta, and the question was asked around the world, what could Shell have done more, differently, better to have used its voice, its presence, its dominant presence to help avert those executions. So it was really the sweatshop labor issues, not any single incident, but certainly Ken Saro-Wiwa, Agoni 9, Shell, that crystallized this contemporary movement. So we had a business and conflict prong bang on from the very beginning. So what I'm going to walk through, having tried to establish that, and by the way, that not only was the impetus as I saw it of the contemporary business and human rights and business conflict and human rights agendas, very much overlapping, but that was when we began to pivot from early CSR, corporate social responsibility, which was very much present in the US in particular, going back to the 70s. But that whole agenda began to move from the margins to the mainstream in the late 90s and ever since. Contemporary corporate responsibility, sustainability, We call a lot of it now ESG. That's a whole other issue, particularly in the US these days. So the proposition I just want to put to you is that the business and human rights and business and conflict agendas were conjoined at birth in the mid-90s. They have been inseparably intertwined, and I would argue increasingly so, ever since. So when I step back and I look at, as a participant, not just an observer, but both, in this field, I think about the convergence of business, human rights, and conflict. I see the action play out on two intersecting playing fields. The dominant one is what I would call, for shorthand, for lack of a better phrase for the moment, is the micro field of specific conflict issues, whether it's armed conflict or it's local community unrest and protest and interaction with security forces, but the micro context of how individual companies, sometimes whole industries, come into conflict in a certain community, region of a country, or sometimes an entire country. And the issues play out on the ground in usually a sort of multiple micro situations. But the issues raise the most fundamental, profound macro questions about corporate responsibility, the relationship between companies and governments, both host country governments where they're operating or sourcing from, but also their own home country governments. So what I'm going to do as a device, and again, this is the guy with the 2 history degrees, just the way my brain is wired, and when I'm reincarnated doing something else, I'll be wired differently. But for this life, I think of context, facts, events, milestones, landmarks, and it's kind of the way then to get into the analytical frame. So what I'm going to walk through, and because I'm with both in person and online a very expert engaged audience, I'm not going to do a lot of explanation. I'm going to walk through a dozen landmarks or milestones. Everybody here and online is familiar with all of these to varying extents, but I'm going to run through them but offer some analytical observations along the way and then to wrap them up. So there's a dozen. I'm really going to do the micro first, and I would argue that the convergence of business, human rights, and conflict has been much more pronounced, much more visible, much more measurable on the micro level than the macro. And actually, I'll make this point later, which is I think that a big problem we've got is that we have an insufficient connection between the micro and the macro, and there's certain developments in the world in recent months at the global galactic macro level that I think are forcing companies to engage conflict and human rights at that level. Most obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I'll probably end with that. So here are the milestones. So 2000, I'm going to go year by year, not every year, but in the last 2 decades. There was a landmark report published really written by a wonderful woman, Jane Nelson, who's been parked in recent years at the Kennedy School at Harvard. She was close with John Ruggie. She's a Zimbabwean national. And she did this report for the now late great, long defunct Prince of Wales and King Charles International Business Leaders Forum. She did it together with International Alert, still around in London, very much in the conflict arena, and with a now long defunct American entity that I was involved with beginning in the late 80s called the Council for Economic Priorities. They did a wonderful report called The Business of Peace, the private sector as a partner in conflict prevention and resolution. And I became aware of the report as they were putting it together in '99. I spoke at an event launching it at NYU Stern School of Business, or maybe it was the law school, whichever, the law school in 2000. And the reason I spoke at it was that in parallel, I came into this job as U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, running the bilateral human rights diplomacy and labor rights around the world. But I had this crazy idea that there was a big problem with extractives, conflict zones, security forces, corporate responsibility, lack thereof. So I used our convening power, and I spent hundreds of hours with my team to develop what became the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. But it was serendipity that the hard intellectual and analytical work was happening in parallel through this Business for Peace report while I was doing the hard work bureaucratically, diplomatically, politically to put together this multi-stakeholder initiative that became the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. So the VPs, as they've been known ever since, and I've not been officially involved with them since I left state, as I was informed and ordered to on January 20, 2001, when we had a change of government. But I've been intimately involved unofficially ever since. But the VPs, interestingly, and not very well known, have their main sections are company interactions. We're talking oil and mining companies, and now there's some agricultural companies in it, but oil and mining company interactions with security forces, police and military, but also private security. The first substantive section, though, of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, and I remember editing the draft of this from State Department Legal in July of 2000. The first substantive section of the VPs is called Human Rights Risk Assessment. This is 11 years before UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Fast forward to the next milestone, and sorry if I'm being a little self-referential because I've been involved in a lot of this. So I spent the month of January 2002 in Jakarta, Jayapura, and all around West Papua with my predecessor in the same role at state, two consultants, both with some supposed independent standing in the human rights community. We were hired by BP to do a human rights risk assessment of the Tangguh LNG project, which is, became a $6 or $8 billion project. And I mention this in the conflict context because there was, and now still, all these years, a low intensity conflict, a kind of somnolent for the most part, but it's sometimes active and violent separatist movement. So when we delivered our 30,000 word report to BP in London in April of 2002, we were told, gentlemen, you've just delivered the first ever human rights impact assessment in the world by any company in any industry, to which I said, geez, thanks for telling us. Now I know why this was so damn hard. We just kind of made it up. So that happened, and I give huge credit to BP at the time. Whatever we think about them now on fossil fuels, of course, Deepwater Horizon in the US a dozen years ago, they were the leader on human rights in the extractive sector, and I couldn't have done the VPs, obviously, without the US government convening power, but without BP and Shell, who got it, unlike the US companies, and I needed to have the British companies in the room with the American companies so they could see that you could talk to Human Rights Watch, you could talk to Amnesty, you can talk to International Alert, it's not scary. And the one quick point I'll make on the VPs before moving back and then beyond human rights impact assessment is, and this is so fundamental in everything we try to do, which is trying to understand and respect the other side's bottom line. And what made the VPs happen was not just the US government convening power and having the British companies in the room, but it was through a multi-stakeholder dialogue, and this was almost unprecedented. I mean, getting lefty NGOs together in the room with big oil and mining companies, this was not easy. But what the breakthrough was to get the NGOs to understand that these companies had legitimate, necessary security arrangements, that they had to deal with military and police and private security providers, that there were threats to personnel, their own people, but also installations and operations, and it was legitimate to have to do this. But the corollary proposition was to get the companies to say, okay, thank you for understanding why we need to do this, but we understand, accept, and will act on your bottom line, which is that we have to integrate our security arrangements with basic human rights safeguards. Once we got to that meeting of minds in the summer of 2000, I knew we would have the deal. There was a lot of, Exxon tried to kill it, Occidental Petroleum tried to kill it, I had to kill snakes left and right, but we got it done. So moving on from the VPs, moving on from Tangguh, so fast forward then, and I'm not going to spend more than a moment on this. I spent a lot of time with my team at Calvert in the mid-2000s. But we had the Sudan divestment movement, active conflict, horrible atrocities. Colin Powell, Secretary of State, called it a genocide. Big divestment movement, really led in the U.S. and the most significant divestment movement ever on human rights after the anti-apartheid divestment movement, and one of the really three great divestment movements, now fossil fuel divestment movement, that's been gathering pace in the U.S. And elsewhere in the last decade or so. So you have that very much focused on conflict. And I should say there that we had, and I remember being quoted in the Wall Street Journal to this effect, which is one of the reasons I'm on probably the can't get into Beijing list for other more recent reasons. But I remember saying, we got two audiences for this. Darfur, stop the atrocities. Beijing, your companies have human rights risks and responsibilities too. Get with the program. So fast forward, moving on. EITI, Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, not a human rights initiative per se, really governance, anti-corruption, but the origin of it, which I know well, not just because I represented Oxfam on the first EITI board from 06 to 09, but in two back-to-back conversations, 12 hours apart, basically gave number 10 Downing Street the idea for it. So, but it relates to conflict. And you know what EITI does? You have to disclose revenue payments, the governments in turn, and the whole point from an Oxfam or publish what you pay point of view is to empower civil society to hold their governments accountable for how they use oil, gas, and mineral resources to diminish the so-called resource curse and have some accountability around natural resource governance. But the origin of it was when I was in London, where I am all the time, but right after doing the month in Jakarta in Papua for BP, this is February or March of 01, I have dinner with one of my best friends from university in England, who's then head of the Cabinet Office think tank and number 10, the policy unit number 10, concurrently for Blair, and he says, we'll catch up in a few minutes, but we got to talk shop here. What was the thing you did with the Foreign Office a year ago? And I said, it was, security forces, conflict zones. He said, look, the Prime Minister had me in a few hours ago. He said, you and your team are going to come up with a post 9/11 security of supply, oil supply initiative, to which I said, I'm a world-class non-expert on Persian Gulf security of supply. You're talking to the wrong guy. And he said, I actually am talking to the right guy. Just think for a second. And I said, look, don't think just Gulf and Middle East. This is global. Don't just think about protection of tankers against terrorist attacks and so that the oil could continue to ship. Think global, think big, think long term. This is about corruption and governance, rule of law. And he said, great, please cancel your morning schedule, whatever you're doing here in London, Raw. You need to do the 3-hour version for my team. And that became EITI. I had nothing to do with writing the particulars, but that was the germ of the idea of it. It was in a conflict, business and conflict context, as well as about the biggest geopolitical context imaginable. Okay, so now we're going to get moving along here. So then you have Ruggie mandate. 05, renewed in 8, culminates with the guiding principles in 11. Young woman, Christine Bader, who'd been on the junior person on the BP client team working with us in the Tango HRA, goes on secondment from BP to Ruggie's team. Vanessa Zimmerman, who many of you know here in Melbourne, later was on the team. I'm going to see her late today. I haven't seen her, I guess, since before the pandemic. But Ruggie spent a lot of time with Christine, but also me, because Ruggie and I were close beginning in 2000 on human rights impact assessments and due diligence, because I was the guy, who had convened the U.S. government, all these companies and NGOs to create the voluntary principles and done Tango. So in 08, the protect, respect, remedy framework was established. In 11, June, was the guiding principles. And the really beating heart of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, once you look under the hood and you get past protect, respect, remedy, the two beating hearts that were big innovations were first human rights due diligence, which frankly I think we laid the basis for through Voluntary Principles, and then BP, I give all credit to them for commissioning this thing. But Ruggie and his team were the ones who said, this we need to systematize, we're going to consolidate, elevate, bang. And so the whole kind of beating heart, if you will, of the business human rights world the last decade has been around human rights due diligence, and now we hope mandatory human rights due diligence playing out in the EU and elsewhere. Concurrently, we had Dodd-Frank 1502 on conflict minerals in the US, DRC, Congo focused, and I was dual-hatted both as Senior Vice President Calvert and as what else was the chair of the Global Witness Advisory Board, and that got done. It took 3 years to get the rule through the SEC. It's a mess. You wouldn't want to wish an SEC rulemaking process as your worst enemy. So that all happened. You then had 2011 to 16 different iterations from the OECD. Beginning in 2011, the due diligence for responsible supply chain of minerals from conflict-affected areas. That now is going to get translated in different permutations into the whole critical minerals arena way beyond Congo. Then, I'm going to really go quick here. Then another theme came up that interrelates business, conflict, and human rights. And this is one that I got in the middle of, and it's been half to 2/3 of my time, mostly pro bono the last half dozen years, which is going back to Shell and Ken Saro-Wiwa. Civic space being scrunched around the world. Human rights defenders threatened and attacked everywhere around the world. Land and environmental defenders, indigenous community leaders, human rights lawyers and activists, Central America, the Andean region, South and Southeast Asia, all over the world. So I was asked by the Business Human Rights Resource Center, International Service for Human Rights, to write what became the report on why and how multinational corporations should, in their own interest, support civic freedoms and human rights defenders. That report, some of you are familiar of, it's been all over since, is Shared Space Under Pressure, Business Support for Civic Freedoms and Human Rights Defenders. And I spent 2 years after the year doing it, spending half my time promoting it. I think I must have done 70 or 80 university lectures, corporate presentations, foreign ministry presentations, conference panels, and it's now in multiple corporate policies. And I've just completed a 60-page guidance for the Voluntary Principles in Security and Human Rights on protecting defenders, and a 40-page one for Unilever, and both are going to be published in the next 6 to 8 weeks. But a lot of the reason I mentioned the defenders piece is so much of it is in a conflict context. There have been spin-offs from shared space. The UN Working Group on Business Human Rights did a more narrowly focused guidance, complementary to shared space. They did a much better job than we did on remedy. We didn't really try to get into that. Chatham House, I worked on a report for them called The Role of the Private Sector in Supporting Civic Space. There's a UN working group, UN Global Compact Business Framework for SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and that project was led by my friend Christine Kulias, who came back from New York to Adelaide 18 months ago, and I'm spending the day with her here on Saturdays, one of the reasons I'm here. Australian footprints, fingerprints everywhere on everything good and important, at least in my professional world. So you have all that. You then have also, and this is the pivot to the final set of points I'm going to make. The other big report is the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and you all know Surya Deva. He was on the working group, no longer, but he's now the special rapporteur. I'm going to see him in Sydney sometime next week. But they commissioned, along with UNDP, my friend Jared Pashud, who Jonathan also knows, who was on Team Ruggie as a former Swiss diplomat. And he wrote this fabulous heightened human rights due diligence for business and conflict-affected areas. So I'm going to just make a quick pivot and end on these points. I've been talking mostly about the convergence of policy and practice for business, human rights, and conflict in mostly micro situations. Well, bang, we have been in the macro world at the same time, and I think all along, but really explicitly in the last couple of years. Two seminal events. February 2021, February 2022, February 2021, coup in Myanmar, the Myanmar Center for Corporate Responsibility, led by Vicky Bowman, former UK ambassador in Yangon, put out a statement with a bunch of companies calling for the release of political detainees. They made me happy by calling for shared space between civil society and the business community and rolling back the coup. She was in prison for her efforts. She's now out. I just saw her in London a couple months ago. But then you had, of course, February 24th, 2022, Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And to fast forward on that, I've been part of B for Ukraine, Business for Ukraine, ever since I'm a co-founder. I'm one of the leaders of it. Our declaration that came out 13 months ago characterized, and this has been repeated, picked up elsewhere, that Putin's attack on Ukraine is also an attack on the international rules-based order. So that's where I'm hoping we're going to go with business, conflict, and human rights, is to get these multinational corporations who have benefited so enormously and profitably for 3/4 of a century from this battered rules-based international order of ours, that's the foundation of the international community and the global economy, to get these companies to understand they've got some responsibilities. And one of them, in my view, is to get out of Russia. And many, many, many have, more than even got out of South Africa, although hundreds are still there. We're working on it every day. But one of the silver linings, and there are no silver linings out of this butchery in the trenches, World War I style, but one of the positives that I think can nonetheless at least help this field is that there's now greater impetus for human rights due diligence in general, conflicts-focused human rights due diligence in particular. We're making a big deal out of this through our interactions with investors and with companies. I've been calling for two things, to the extent it matters what I call for, which is hardly, but the two things, the micro thing I call for is a fusion of political risk analysis that multinationals have been doing for half a century, since the 70s. They do this globally, they do it regionally, they do it country specifically, but a fusion of that with human rights risk assessment. Hardly anybody connects the dots. They're just beginning to now. Had they connected the dots when Putin went into Crimea and Donbass in 2014, they would have seen the writing on the wall and not have been as shocked as they were on February 24, 2022. And then finally, geopolitical corporate responsibility. And I've been speaking and writing about this nice idealistic concept, but by God, you know, these companies have some responsibilities, and they're going to get tested. They're being tested now in Russia, Ukraine. I just came from Singapore, gave a talk to most of the corporate audience Monday evening there, and Russia, Ukraine got their attention because it rattled them. They lose sleep about the analogies, of course, to China and Taiwan, and that's a front porch issue for Australia, US, AUKUS, the whole deal. If there's an attack in this region, Putin's upsetting a challenge of the international community and global economy will be just the appetizer course. I mean, this will be cataclysmic for everybody. So I think, I'll just end on this point, I think that there is now, we have micro standards in a lot of areas, more macro standards like the UN Guiding Principles, you know, micro standards like the Voluntary Principles, Security, Human Rights, as inconsistent as they may be in many, many areas. But we live now in midway through this third decade of the 21st century in an era of extraordinary geopolitical tension and conflict. And I think that companies are being forced to get a grip with these issues more than ever, both on the ground and the micro context where they've been engaged for a quarter century, but now having to think about the big macro risks and responsibilities they face. So I'll end with that. If these boardrooms aren't churning with anxiety, they're not doing their jobs. So that's my reflection through what they're worth on a big subject.
Yeah. Thanks, Bennett.
Thank you.
Bennett gets a chug of water, please.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, questions, and I'll monitor the chat online. Otherwise, you can put your hand up. Questions, comments, observations. Yes. Sure, please.
Thank you so much for that. really intimate history of the development of norms related to business human rights and conflict. I was just wondering, coming from a US perspective, what do you think the chances are for the treaty, business human rights treaty that's being negotiated, which has that emphasis on protecting human rights defenders, on remedy, a little more than a human rights due diligence approach? How likely do you think it is to get the support of the US and other OECD countries?
US, inconceivable. I'm just being very frank here. So, I was tried to be on the cutting edge of a pretty liberal, progressive, Clinton administration, at least in this area, not in the domestic areas that frankly appalled me. But, just looking at it from a White House or a State Department International Organizations Bureau or legal office of legal advisor perspective, this is too hard. And where I think that the norms all collapsed. We knew that was in 02 and 03, unrealistic. Hardly any engagement with the business community. And then we had the Ruggie mandate, which actually succeeded phenomenally, at least in creating the floor, not the ceiling, but the floor. Hardly the ceiling. God help us if the ceiling, but a pretty sturdy floor. I think that the treaty discussions, which I've never been involved with, and I follow intermittently, are useful to have those out there to remind these companies that if you don't do what's already established, if you don't do the voluntary multi-stakeholder standards, if you don't do the mandatory human rights due diligence through the UK, or through the EU, if you don't do 1502 on conflict minerals to the US, UK and Australia, modern slavery and so forth, if you don't do these things seriously, there really will be a chance of a treaty that will make you deeply unhappy. And so I think it's critically important to have it out there. I think the chances, I can't speak to all the OECD countries, many of those governments I've worked with, but I can't speak to all that politically and diplomatically, but I can tell you that it's a big enough lift to get mandatory human rights due diligence through the EU. I was involved off the record, but maybe this is on a record, in a effort with the ICAR grouping of NGOs that's international, but it's based in Washington. Secretary of Treasury Yellen made some unfortunate comments to some Republican legislators on Capitol Hill about 2 months ago, worrying about the EU due diligence, mandatory human rights due diligence, saying, well, we don't like extraterritoriality. I felt that was a little rich coming from the US government of either party, and saying there could be undue burdens on US business. And of course, my view and the view of my colleagues is if it's burdensome to do human rights due diligence, that's not a good thing, that's a great thing. Yes, make it efficient and make it particularly minimal for small and medium-sized companies, be sensitive there. But big multinationals in high-risk, sensitive sectors, if this isn't at least somewhat burdensome, it's not worth it, and we're going to go after you to do it. So that's kind of the politics of this thing, but I can't envision a U.S. government support, even the most committed to these issues, Democratic administration supporting something like the treaty, even though it's been revised and amended in ways that are more pragmatic that you would think would make it have a better chance of selling in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere.
But, okay. No, go. And Natalia, I saw that you have a question. I'm going to ask you to verbalize it though, because I can't summarize your bullet points.
Thank you, Bennett. I'm not an academic, but I am an alumni of RMIT and also, for transparency, Daisy's partner, who's actually far more qualified than me to speak on issues. One reflection and one question for you, just in relation to the role of the Myanmar Centre for Responsible Business. I would argue that that statement actually did potentially more damage than good.
Oh no.
I think it provided arguably a smokescreen for big multinationals like Chevron and Total to keep producing oil and gas and funneling money to the junta. It took almost 12 to 18 months of campaign for those companies to leave. It's unfortunate one of our colleagues has left the room, but the garment sector, which I think was a part of that statement, is still supporting the regime at about $3.2 billion US in Myanmar. So I think, an okay statement, but what was the effects of it, and probably assessment is needed.
Good point.
I think the good thing to come out of, the one sort of positive to come out of the coup was the international solidarity movements, particularly led by diaspora in places like Washington, DC and the States as well.
Sure.
But my question is more around accountability, and we've had all these standards, and you very articulately, laid them out in a really lovely way, and I wish I was taking notes, but
I can send you the bullet.
No, please do. I mean, 3 recent cases which I think show and demonstrate a lack of accountability from some of these standards. So firstly, the OECD multinational guidelines for enterprises, a recent case involving an Australian mining company in breach of the guidance. There's no accountability. There's some reports, a bit of media pressure. Nothing really happens to the company if they come to the table. That's a weakness in the guidelines. I want to get your reflection on what can be done to actually improve accountability as well.
Oh yeah.
If we look at sanctions, another case I've been involved with involving an Australian mining company in Russia, Tigers Realm, still exporting coal, still mining coal, even though coal is an exported sanctioned good under law. How does that work? How can Australian companies be still essentially funding the Putin regime? And then thirdly, with the EITI, Chevron and Exxon, who you know well, Exxon for years has been undermining this standard.
Oh, I know.
They're still a part of the standard. How does that work?
I know.
So where's the accountability? So we should get your reflections on what you've done and how accountability can be strengthened.
Okay, so I'm going to hit these really quickly. I love these points. So first of all, in Myanmar, so I'll plead guilty to having been sympathetic, to the statement in the Myanmar Center for Corporate Responsibility, because I was on the board of the Institute for Human Rights and Business in London when we incubated what became the Myanmar Center. And I know Vicky not well personally, but then she was in prison. So, I like and respect her a lot, even though I don't know her very well. So I have that little bit of built-in bias, but I take your point. And I'm familiar with Chevron and Total. I've tangled with Chevron in particular for years. I won't say where the statement came, but some people asked me a couple months ago for advice on a conversation they were going to have with Chevron on some of these issues. And I said, well, I have a long history with them that was not always very happy, but if it's helpful for me to join the conversation, I would be prepared to do so. And the answer was that whoever they were talking to on the Chevron side knew that I was associated with the people we were going to talk about. And they called me out by name, even though it's somebody I'd never heard of at Chevron, who said, we know that guy. He has a long history with us. We respect him, but it would not be constructive if he were part of the conversation. So I have a long history with him. Frankly, I'll just say it. It was harder to get Chevron to yes on the VPs in the end of 2000 than all the other UK and US oil and mining companies, plus Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, International Alert, and the UK and all the different parts of the US governments put together. And that tells you something. That said, they're still in it. On EITI, I worked, it's years ago I was on that board, 06 to 9, but I worked convivially, but at times critically, and stayed in touch with their longtime board member, a former UK diplomat, and nice guy, clubbable, Pall Mall clubs. I've had drinks with him half a dozen years ago, but they had no board terms, and that guy was on their board for like 16 years. And guess what? And I don't want to blame him personally or Chevron, although maybe I'm implying that, but they created a civil society protocol, they call it, in EITI, that relates to their validation process, but also relates to something I was involved with when I was on the EITI board early, which relates later to the Shared Space Under Pressure report, which was when Publish What You Pay activists or civil society EITI people in country were harassed, intimidated, sometimes physically attacked, that EITI would come to their aid. And they have, the companies, those couple companies, I think, have blocked. I don't want to use the word blocked, even though I just did. I may not be right, but I think there's some correlation between the attitudes of some of those companies and the lack of movement there. So I have no illusions there. And then finally, and this is a broader, a broader point here, and this goes to kind of all my experience over the years, where I've both been do the inside game, but also the outside game. I mean, Oxfam, Global Witness, but frankly, when I'm in the room with Oxfam and Global Witness, I'm the one who is the pragmatic diplomat who's trying to frame things in a way that won't get you kicked out of the room, at least not for 10 minutes, And so, but my view is I have gained ever more respect through my work playing both the inside and outside game and both the bottoms up and the top down games, all concurrently on multiple issues. I've gained ever more respect for you can never take your eye off the ball of implementation and accountability. And if you just take it on faith, whether it's EITI or the Voluntary Principles, Security, Human Rights, the Fair Labor Association, or the Ethical Trading Initiative, or any of this stuff, on Modern Slavery Act in Australia or UK, and I'm well aware, particularly the UK, of how unhappy people are with these kind of milquetoast, lousy submissions. If you're not focusing and holding their feet to the fire, you're not getting it and you're not doing your job. And there has to be a absolutely dynamic, and I'll just say it, at times militant, imposition of accountability. I believe in legislation, often regulation, very often, and frankly, litigation. But also diplomacy, also dialogue, also multi-stakeholder standard setting. And there's a whole architecture. I've been fortunate to be involved in a lot of the pieces of it, and they don't all fit together neatly. It's kind of messy, but I'm a huge believer in, I mean, just take the cotton campaign in Uzbekistan. We got, yes, their brutal dictator died, and his successor was not brutal in the same way Karimov. And they had a new generation of reformers in their government, but it was our combination of economic confrontation, a boycott of 330 apparel brands, no Uzbek cotton, and our diplomatic engagement. Confrontation and engagement, economic pressure and political dialogue, not one, but both. And frankly, the diplomacy that I've largely led with the Uzbek government, the US government, the ILO, would not have succeeded had we not have the hard leverage of basically shutting down, at least for North America, Australia, Europe, UK, exports of raw cotton. We did that. So it all has to fit together, and that's my fervent view. We all have our own angles. I've been fortunate, lucky, and frankly deliberate at times to be working both the tough guy side but also the good cop side, and I think it all has to work together. Bang.
Thank you. I'm just conscious of the clock. Natalia, you have this beautifully eloquent question in the chat. Do you want to summarize verbally for Bennett?
Yep.
I will try. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Bennett, thank you so much for this presentation. Yes, I have written my question. I will try to go through it because I have pretty much several questions within it. I'm Russian. I have been researching corporate social responsibility for years now, and since the beginning of the war, I'm concerned about corporate political responsibility, both as researcher and citizen. And my question is this, that since the beginning of the war, we can see the unprecedented scaling up of anti-humane laws in Russia. We can see how this repressive regime has become even more repressive, how it has become even more outlaw. Basically, we see that at the same time, so many corporations have left. It has been also unprecedented, and I think at some point it became more corporations left Russia than Iran, for example, at some point of time. While I think that it has been morally a right thing to do, I thought it a year ago, I still believe it is so. I would like to actually ask a bit twisted question, because with all this growth of anti-humane laws in Russia, and with the growth of aggressive anti-Western rhetoric by Putin and by others in Russia, and in the space where there is emptiness now and there are no corporations, no NGOs, there is a free room for this aggression to keep growing. Does it mean that all these corporations in a way have done a favor to Putin by leaving the country and leaving him to this potential to grow this repressive regime into even more repressive? And he has been also referring to decolonization project and decolonizing rhetoric since recently a lot, and he has been establishing allies in this area with post-colonial countries. But at the same time, we can see that there are some elements of truth here in this rhetoric when we see Europe still buying gas from Russia and pretty much financing this war, while we have corporations left the country. Does it mean that Western countries and all actors, like you were talking about, all the multi-actor initiatives that we should really pursue, does it mean that we all should speed up with decolonization project and make it work before it gets nullified by Russia and other repressive regimes? That's my question.
Oh my gosh.
In 25 words or less.
Yeah, I'd like to have a longer, conversation with you. I don't know where you're based, but you're challenging, and I think very reasonably, some of the premises of what we're trying to do through Business for Ukraine, which, I think everybody would agree is well-intentioned, but there is an argument that, do we really want all the Western companies out? And we come down, including me on the steering committee, yes, but, there are some dilemmas. We come down on the side, yes, we want them out because we feel at this stage of the war that just remaining present and contributing the amount of tax they do, tax revenue, to the regime makes them by definition at least indirectly complicit in the war effort. However, one could reasonably say now that there's a huge punitive confiscatory exit tax imposed on companies that leave, now that we see seizures of assets of Western companies that are in the process of leaving, as we saw with Danone and Carlsberg just last month, that then maybe there's some reasons to pause and reflect here. Then there are some companies, Unilever among them, who I've known well, and I've just mentioned I've done some work with them very recently on human rights defenders, that really worry very sincerely and seriously about how their employees are going to be treated. And then there's also the bigger question of, okay, you sell the assets, you're going to pay a big exit tax, but who are you selling to? Is it a great thing to be selling them to Putin's cronies, some of these oligarchs, who are part of this regime in the worst ways? So I got to tell you, there are some. This is not a clean balance sheet where all the arguments are on the exit side. I have to say that. And even if some of my Ukrainian colleagues would take exception with me saying this in this setting. And then finally, I will say this is something that Be for Ukraine accepted, that I was very much supportive of, that my wife and her job as vice president for global advocacy for the Wikimedia Foundation was directly involved in, was together with Access Now and a couple of other NGOs, was successfully lobbying the US government, the State Department, the Treasury Department, and the White House to carve out exceptions for internet service providers to continue to operate in Russia. For God's sake, we don't want to cut off Russian civil society, even if a lot of Russian civil society may support Putin in this awful war. But do we really want to cut them off the global internet and Wikipedia? For God's sake, no. So we have to look at this, there's some gray areas here, and I felt that decision by the US government that my wife, Rebecca McKinnon, played a key role in bringing about was absolutely the right thing. And God help Russia and the world if all of the people who believe in rule of law, democracy, and human rights, who want to build some kind of a better Russian future, have all left the country. So I understand there's some real ethical and political dilemmas here that you're wrestling with that I very much respect. So thank you for this. I'd love to talk with you more.
I'm conscious of time.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I do have to close out our proceedings. We have gone a little bit over time. Thank you, Bennett. Thank you so much. A round of applause for Bennett.
I really appreciate this. Thank you so much for your great questions and your time.
Thanks for coming to RMIT. Thank you for coming to Melbourne. I know you're going to have a great time. Yeah. Let me end where you started, which is with optimism. I'd like to suggest that folks like you with a conscience, with a heart, with so much energy and enthusiasm for this, that's something that gives me and many others optimism for the future of the relationship between business, human rights.
Thank you. So many people doing good work in this field, and so many of them in Australia doing the work here and around the world, and the work that you're doing now to try to swing this vote in the right direction, which I'm following. There was a great piece in the FT a couple of weeks ago about much of the business community. I hope they're going to hold firm, being supportive. That's my own editorial comment on your politics. But, but my point is, sure, I try to do some useful things here and there, but the people I work with around the world are just fabulous. Just fantastic. The human rights defenders in Uzbekistan, just amazing people. But Australia is so important, and the community of practitioners, academics, and activists here are make some of the biggest contributions globally, and it's about time that people like me, who just see my Australian friends in London and Geneva and Washington, actually show up once in a while to learn from you guys. So thank you.
You're always welcome back.
Thank you.
We're pretty damn good at soccer too.
The Matildas, I was all for them. Gosh, but they had all that heart. I had to root for the Americans first, but once we got to the Brits, the English. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Cheers.
everyone.
Thank you. If anybody